This video is brought to you by Shudder, a premium video service by AMC Networks offering the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural titles, all uncut and commercial-free. Now, if you're like me and you live for year-round spooks, then it goes without saying that Shudder is definitely made for our kind. Being the Netflix of horror, it's got all kinds of stuff from the classics, all the way to random crap that you would never come across otherwise. Here are some titles that I would personally recommend. Ringu, of course, if you haven't seen the 1998 version, then do so right now. Noroi the Curse, another spooky J-horror flick to watch if you've already seen Ringu. The Wailing, perfect for all you Koreaboos out there. Ginger Snaps, probably the only werewolf movie that I've ever actually enjoyed. Grave Encounters, like many, this is my favorite found footage movie ever. Eli Roth's History of Horror, a docuseries covering everything from slashers all the way to kaiju. Now, as you can probably tell, variety is key when it comes to Shudder, and that's absolutely my favorite thing about it. You get unlimited access for just $5.99 per month or $56.99 per year. But if you'd like to try before you buy, then get a 30-day free trial at Shudder.com using promo code ReignBot. That's SHUDDER.com and promo code ReignBot. It's a story all too familiar while still being almost too awful to imagine. A family out for a walk in broad daylight looks away for just a moment, and in a matter of seconds, their child disappears. Years of media coverage, alleged sightings, hoaxes, and even wild theories ultimately amount to nothing, and to this day, a family remains shattered. Tonight we discuss the disappearance of Shinya Matsuoka. In March of 1989, Shinya Matsuoka was just 4 years old and resided in Ibaraki Prefecture with his mom, dad, older sister, and younger brother. Amidst the otherwise beautiful Japanese springtime, the Matsuokas received news that was both sudden and heartbreaking. Shinya's maternal grandmother had passed away, and for the young family this meant packing up immediately and making the journey all the way to a city called Komatsushima in Tokushima Prefecture. Funeral arrangements were to be set in motion the very next day. Following the service in Komatsushima, the family would retreat to a relative's house about an hour away in a small town called Sadamitsu. Said home was nestled amongst a rural community, flanked by mountainous terrain and a river that stretched for miles. Now, in spite of recent events, the Matsuokas held their heads up high. It was now March 7th, and the family got up bright and early to take a stroll around town. Mom decided to stay back while Dad, along with the 3 Matsuoka children and a couple of their cousins, set out on their walk. All in all, this walk was fairly brief, only lasting about 10 or so minutes, which was just not enough for young Shinya, who wanted to keep going. According to the boy's father, upon returning, the pack made their way up the stairs that led to the family home. He carried the youngest sibling in his arms, while the rest of the kids followed. Shinya was a bit behind, but not by much. Once at the summit, the father looked behind him, noted that Shinya had made it to the top, then quickly headed inside to hand off the baby to his wife. As you can imagine, this took no time at all, just enough to walk down a hallway and back. When Shinya's father turned around, he noticed the boy hadn't followed him inside, and upon making it to the doorway, he saw nothing. Shinya was gone, vanished, nowhere to be seen. Of course, the first assumption here would be that the boy strayed away somewhere on property. After all, according to the family, eyes were only off of the child anywhere from 20 to 40 seconds. Wherever Shinya was, logic would lead us to believe that it was impossible for him to have gone very far. Now, of course, if Shinya had been found in the moments following this, then we obviously would not be sitting here talking about this right now. The family searched, but to no avail. Soon, the authorities would be involved, and hundreds would search the town and surrounding wilderness, but in the end, Shinya was simply gone. With cases like this, the details of the situation are immediately and rightfully drawn into scrutiny, so here are the considerations for the case of Shinya's disappearance. To start off, we need to paint a better picture of the area in which this all took place. The town of Sadamitsu actually does not exist on paper in the modern day. This is because in the mid-2000s, it merged with nearby towns. Now that said though, just before the merger, Sadamitsu was said to have roughly 5,700 residents, all living within about 17 square miles. For reference, Manhattan is slightly bigger, 23 square miles, but is home to approximately 1.6 million people. The takeaway here that I'm trying to illustrate is that while this was a rural community engulfed by vast wilderness, the Matsuokas weren't completely isolated themselves and did still have neighbors, none of which were apparently aware that the family would be staying at the home when they did. This is also backed up by some archival images of the area from 1991. As you can see, there is a lot of uncharted territory, but still enough civilization for it to be significant. This info comes as sort of a double-edged blade. While it does open up the possibility of Shinya having been taken, there is also the fact that this was such a small town that anyone who did so might have a hard time getting away with it. No one in the town saw Shinya following this incident, at least not that anyone knows of. Immediately following Shinya's disappearance, the family set up a recording device on their home phone. This, as it turns out, would lead to one of the standout moments of this investigation. Whether or not it actually means anything is up for debate, but nonetheless, it cannot be ignored. Masanobu Matsuoka, Shinya's dad, had received a call from a woman, one who sounded a lot like a Tokushima local based on her accent. The woman wanted to speak to the mother of the household, so that's when Keiko Matsuoka took over. The mysterious woman began explaining that she was the mother of Mariko Nakahara, a student from Seiki Kindergarten. Now, Keiko actually recognized the school because it was the place that Shinya's older sister attended back home in Ibaraki. Mrs. Nakahara continued, explaining that she'd heard about what happened and started a fund to help the Matsuokas out. She wanted to know where to send the money and if the family would be returning to Ibaraki anytime soon, and in fact they were. The next day, the family finally headed back, tragically, without their son. Some time went by, and Mrs. Nakahara had gone silent. Curious, Keiko decided to contact her child's school to ask if they knew anything about this fund, and here's where things get bizarre. Not only was the school unaware of anything about a fund, but they also said that they didn't even have a student named Mariko Nakahara. This puzzling revelation led the family to reflect on the call, and upon thinking it over, they realized a few unsettling things. Again, Shinya disappeared in Tokushima, which is where the family received the call from Mrs. Nakahara, who, according to Keiko and Masanobu, clearly had a local accent. If she was in fact local, then how did she know anything about the Matsuoka's life back in Ibaraki? How would she know what school Shinya's sister attended? Even worse, this person even knew which group Shinya's sister belonged to within said school. On the flip side of this, if this person really was from Ibaraki like they claimed, how did they know what was going on all the way in Tokushima? Keep in mind this is 1989, and only about a week after Shinya had gone missing. News of this case hadn't hit national headlines yet, and it would have been highly unlikely for anyone outside the family's immediate circles to have known their phone number. We'll return to this later on in the video, but Mrs. Nakahara was really the last possible lead in the case at the time. After their return home, Keiko and Masanobu would spring into action by trying to get as much media attention on Shinya as possible. Dozens of TV appearances would follow, along with the Matsuokas posting their home phone number publicly in order to receive tips. One by one, they started to pour in and continued doing so for years, but ultimately none led to any significant developments. People claimed to have seen Shinya in a nearby city, a department store hundreds of miles away, a park, the subway. None of these tips would help, however, and the case grew cold. The 90s and 2000s came and went, as did the majority of the 2010s, but in 2018, this case would see another bizarre and ultimately upsetting turn.
実はですね、今から29年ほど前に、はい、4歳の少年が行方不明になった四国でのそういった事案があります。で、警察もその情報を公開しているものがあるんですね。はい、その少年の名前は松岡信也君という4歳の時に行方不明に。
Kinkyo Kokairai Sosaku, or roughly translated as Urgent Public Search, is a long-running investigative documentary series that airs semi-annually on the Japanese TV station TBS. Just to provide some further context, the show isn't exactly the usual docuseries you might be used to seeing out in the West. Instead, it's presented almost like a game show, complete with a set, MC, and a panel of hosts. The show focuses on real-life mysteries concerning missing people, including those who might actually be missing themselves. By that, I mean individuals that either have memory loss or might not know their actual backgrounds for one reason or another. The goal of the show is to bring these people on to tell their stories in the hopes that the signal boost across the country would lead to eventual solutions. In their spring 2018 season, the show featured a young man who went by the pseudonym Ryoto Wada, and his story was almost too incredible to be believed. Wada wasn't suffering from amnesia, rather his particular situation began when he was too young to understand what was even going on. According to him, at the time of his appearance, he was roughly 25 years old and unsure of the whereabouts of his family. Per Wada, his earliest memory dates back to when he was roughly 4 years old. He recalls some kind of trip with his parents that eventually landed him at the house of an uncle he hadn't met yet. This uncle was described by Wada as being a large man somewhere in his 50s or 60s, and for unknown reasons, this man allegedly never allowed the boy to leave the house, save for a few visits to the dentist. All in all, Wada would claim to have been essentially held captive for a total of 17 years. During this time, he could do nothing but observe his new guardian, as he wasn't even allowed to go outside to attend school. This man, whoever he was, would call him Ryoto, and that's the name he adopted. The last name Wada came from the nameplate on their family home. The captor was often present, usually hunched over in front of a computer, seemingly never emerging from the place himself. The assumption the boy made here was that this person was somehow involved in trading stocks. According to Wada, it wouldn't be until 2014 when he'd finally make his escape. After wandering around for some time, he found himself at a department store in Aichi Prefecture, which, just for reference, is at roughly the midway point between Ibaraki, where Shinya was from, and Tokushima, where he had vanished. As soon as Wada appeared on this show, chatter about him possibly being Shinya swept throughout the country. To many, it seemed like a match. In their opinion, his features seemed to line up, his approximate age wasn't all that far off, and his earliest memories could have explained what happened to Shinya. Just as quickly as Wada's story spread, however, it began to fall apart. Before his TV appearance even ended, people began to talk. One Twitter user posted about how Wada was actually an old employee that worked for them at a convenience store, and this information even made its way to the show while it was still live on air. According to the convenience store owner, the man standing in their studio was actually named Hisashi Kitazawa. At the same time this point was being asserted, the internet did what it does best and unearthed evidence of Wada appearing on TV ages before his 2018 stint. In 2012, a man by the name of Takashi Kitazawa appeared both on TV and in an article by the Asahi Shimbun. Was the topic memory loss or mystery identities? No. These were about mega fans of an idol group, and in case there was any doubt, clips of Wada/Kitagawa were archived as well. On top of this, netizens were able to unearth yearbook photos of this person despite him claiming to have never attended school due to being confined. So at this point, we've got 4 separate names to work with: Wada Ryoto, Takashi Kitazawa, Hisashi Kitazawa, and of course, Shinya Matsuoka. Now, despite where this is all clearly heading, many did have to entertain the possibility that, while convoluted, maybe the situation somehow still added up, especially when we take memory loss into account. Of course, the only way to know for sure would be to do a DNA test, and luckily for everyone following the story, Masanobu was still very much alive and still very much looking for his son. When the story picked up, the now elderly man took to Facebook to issue public statements on the revived investigation into Shinya's disappearance. In the end, it was proven by DNA analysis that Wada/Kitazawa, or whatever his name really is, was not Shinya. And while no one can say for sure, it's generally accepted that this person faked this whole situation for attention, which of course meant leading a family on and getting their hopes up. Following this, some controversy still fell upon the TBS show that featured the Imposter, with many claiming that the show had deliberately staged it for the sake of ratings. While that hasn't been definitely proven, many would point to other seemingly similar instances that would further cast doubt on the show. Again, nothing has been proven, but at this point, at least when it comes to Shinya, it's unfortunately irrelevant. After all this time and all this trouble, we're still no closer to knowing what happened to Shinya, but there are still a few things to consider. The phone call, of course, is obviously something that we just can't ignore. Again, you have the issue of the person having a Tokushima accent, but claiming to be from Ibaraki and also being able to name the school attended by Shinya's sister, and somehow having the phone number of their Tokushima house. I think for many, this could come off as someone close to the family probing for information. After all, it seems that's about the only way all of this info could have been obtained. If this is the case, then why lie? What was the point? Mrs. Nakahara also asked the family when they'd be returning to Ibaraki, so maybe this was all just a way to see if they'd finally be out of the way? There's no way to know for sure, but another theory that many have put forth to explain this phone call is a common scam used all over Japan and even elsewhere for that matter. This is how it's supposed to work. So let's say you've got an elderly person living alone. The scammer cold calls them claiming to be a relative without actually saying a name, and all they have to do is wait for the victim to offer up the information themselves. Going, "Hey, it's me, remember me," etc. could then lead grandma to being like, "Jimmy, is that you?" Then the scammer could go in a number of different directions depending on how things progress. In the case of Mrs. Nakahara, the idea would be that Keiko actually named the kindergarten herself without realizing it, and whoever the caller was just played along. Now, no matter what this call was actually about, it's no doubt bizarre and probably warrants the most attention out of any of the leads to come up in the last few decades. Another popular theory is one that I actually haven't even hinted at yet thus far. It's going to sound a bit out of left field, but bear with me here because it is something that a lot of people at least entertain. One of the earliest alleged sightings of Shinya actually dates back to April of 1989, just weeks after the boy disappeared. The person who claims to have seen Shinya points to Tokushima's coast. There they recall seeing a boy with a man somewhere in his 30s. To them, the man looked rather suspicious, and even more so because upon noticing that someone saw them, the man led the boy to a white car and drove off. As for what this means, many believe it could indicate that Shinya had been abducted and taken to North Korea, which is a thing that happens but obviously can't be proven in this case. Nonetheless, Shinya is considered by many to be a potential victim of these circumstances. Taking things back for a moment, we also need to be open to the possibility that Shinya did in fact get lost somewhere in town. This consideration is grim, but as many have pointed out, it is possible that the boy may have fallen into some kind of storm drain and was just never found. Such things have happened in the past, and unfortunately the probability is probably even higher when we're talking about a small child. Whether it be an accident or someone close to the family or even the work of an outside entity, the truth of the matter is that even all these decades later, Shinya Matsuoka remains missing. And while the chances are most likely incredibly slim, we can only hope that he's still out there somewhere. This video was written, researched, and edited by yours truly. A massive thank you to you all for watching, and an even bigger thank you to the following people. Ogramit Valerie T, 486DX33MHZ, TS Elliott Smith, Lizitar, KMBK Ketchup, TBF, Sol A, Mishimishi David G, Astro Bloody the Elf, T Gorman, Eric M, Daniel G, Stephen A, Zombies Were People Too, Sarah L, Larry, Aesthetic Vamps, Scaredies, Julia R, AJG, Longfoot, Ichlievebrand, Chris M, Scarecrow David L, The Deck of Cards, Mega Brutal, Zimbledorf, The Calzone Consumer, Jamie M, Bad Baphomet, Biznacker, Luck B, Nick Bush, SPC Zippo, Brandon F, Matt J, James M, Zarai, and Saint Maxi.